Start up here. Hopefully you all can hear me. If not, please post on the chat box. We're going to start this up. My name is Manny Straley, and I'm founder and president of Assessment Education Research Experts. Today we're going to talk about something that's very passionate of mine and very passionate about, and it's something that I like to do a lot. Is the competency model, even though it can take a while to complete. Definitely not longer than a year, but typically it's 6-month to 12-month endeavor. So let's go to the next slide here. Just to let us know a little bit about us, we were founded in 2015, so we're going to celebrate our 5 years in May next month. Well, 2 months, I should say. We're in the DC area. I'm the only owner, and that number keeps on ticking up in terms of how many people we have on staff. We like to be small so that we can still be agile and flexible. And one of the really neat things that's happening is that we're very flexible enough that we have already some in-person meetings scheduled, and with this pandemic going on, we're able to convert those things, any of our work, into virtual work. So we are a virtual company and a virtual team, so we do virtual work. And we're going to get into a little bit into that later on. We do have accreditation expertise. In fact, we launched our own accreditation standard in credentialing this past month, called the Credentialing Quality Standard. And if you want to know more about that, you can contact me offline. We've done a lot of work. We've done a lot of competency models too. And we'll get into job analysis, the relationship between job analysis and competency models as well. So one of the things we wanted to emphasize in this current environment is we are a virtual company and we do virtual work. And that means anything that we do in the exam development process, anything around credentialing that we do, can be easily converted or done virtually. And we've done all these things virtually, from the job analysis to item writing to item reviews to standard settings to item analysis reviews, any of that, passing standard setting studies. So just want to emphasize that, given that this is one of the few times we actually communicate to the public. Just a little bit about me. So what's really important is I did nerd out in psychometrics. I did nerd out in becoming a therapist. I almost got a doctorate in it. I did all my coursework. I did a lot of my therapeutic hours. I worked even on parts of my chapters in my dissertation for counseling psychology. And so that piece of it, I still use to facilitate meetings. I am still a certified social therapist. I have a certification also in IT with cybersecurity things, and also data management support, which is more of knowing how to do admin and programming and things like that. So, and I've worked throughout the industry. A lot of you know me. So, we are socially responsible. So that's probably the thing that I like to highlight, because we love doing that. We work with TEDx with their surveys, their conference experience surveys. We've worked with EATP, ATP on supporting various things for them in terms of survey support and other types of supports. We've worked with Special Olympics on their strategy. And we're also discussing whether we want to put out just a free general awareness assessment on this COVID-19, the coronavirus. So we're talking about that with some of our colleagues in the industry, and if any of you want to participate in that, let us know. We're going to make that free. If we do launch it, we're going to use Open Eyes technology to deliver it and register for it. And some of us are going to be writing items with some nurses and some healthcare professionals and doctors and things like that. So we hope to get it out very rapidly, but we're discussing it, how quickly we can get it out and so forth. So that's just a little about it. Now, getting to the main show here. First of all, thank you for attending this. We're going to get into why do you want to do a competency model? And I love that the change management theory of the 4 whys. I think now there's a 5 why one too. So, but ask yourself, why do you want to do it 4 times? And see if it still makes sense. For job analysis, it's pretty straightforward as to why you'd want to do it in credentialing for validity reasons, but you don't necessarily need a competency model if you have a credential. So we're going to talk about the job analysis, then we're going to also spend a little bit of time on what's really the difference between the two. And some of it comes from my own experience, because in the literature, in some cases there's no difference, in some cases there is a difference. And it's very controversial at this point, especially among industrial, organizational, or IO psychologists who spend most of their time on competency modeling. And then we're going to do a little overview of competency modeling. Then we're going to look at, there are generic competency models. Some of you may know the Dreyfus and Dreyfus model, and then there's the Benner model from the nursing world. So those are some high-level models. And then we're going to talk about, like, well, how do you do this from a very high level? So we're going to talk about, once you determine the various competency levels, how do you level it with your SMEs? And then some examples of competency models. And then once you have a competency model, now what do you do with it? And there's a lot of use cases for a competency model. And you could also sort of apply your job analysis to those use cases as well. So that's what we're going to discuss, and then we'll have some time for questions. So this is probably the most essential question to ask if you're going to pursue a competency model. Why are you going to do it? What do you want to do? And that goes back to, like, actually one of our last slides, which is, here are some uses of the competency model. Is it to, develop a stackable credential, which is very easy to convert a competency model into a stackable credential, meaning that, you have a beginner, a vertical stack with a beginner, intermediate, and an expert level individual. So that's really something that you might want to look at and really ask yourself why you're doing this. So this is really coming from my own experience and what I've read about job analysis and competency models over the last 20 years, and how I practice them. I do both of them. Our organization does a lot of this. We actually do 2 or 3 competency models in a year, and we do about 4 or 5, well, we do more than the job. We do about 10 to 20 job analysis in a year. So we're doing a lot of different models of this here. So the job analysis usually is very focused on coming up with some sort of outline so your item writers can write items to it, or to put together a performance assessment, and is one of the inputs, or the actual way of how you put together your performance assessment in terms of a rubric around it. So you have knowledge, skills, and abilities. KSAs are tasks and statements and knowledge statements that you're focused on, and you're focused at a specific performance level defined by your certification. So it might be an intro level certification, it could be an intermediate level, it could be advanced certification. So, but that's already defined by the purpose of your certification, or it should be defined when you begin a job analysis in your strategy. The other piece of it is the competency model. So what's the difference? Well, the competency model doesn't look at one level, it looks at multiple levels. Typically our model, and we'll get into this a little bit more later, is we look at the novice, we look at the intermediate, and then we look at the expert level. We also add outcomes, which we'll get into a little later, but those outcomes can be typically they're worker outcomes, they're organizational outcomes, and the other thing we end up putting in our competency model is also personality factors. We don't do that with a job analysis at all. And then these outcomes could be also your predictors, so you could establish predictive validity if you want to. So how does your level predict performance? Are they more independent? Are they more cost effective, and things like that? And so this leads to many purposes of the competency model, especially for training and assessment. With the assessment piece, you could easily move into a stackable model of credentialing. With education, you could look at, well, what does someone need to achieve to be more independent, to be more efficient, to have less waste at work, things like that. So So that's really the differences there from my perspective. With the job analysis, just getting into a further definition, we're looking at, this is the life cycle again, and we're looking at identifying what goes on the exam, and that's with a focus group or a panel of subject matter experts, and then we have all the experts that are certified or equivalent taking the survey to determine whether it's important and critical. Essentially, sometimes you had the frequency rating scale on it, and then this is used to develop what should be tested on, what you need to test on across different areas of the content, and then you go on to writing items and so forth to meet all the areas of the cycle there. So ironically, the job analysis, because it's been it's an input, it's one of the ways you create a competency model. It's part of that conversation. It's inclusive essentially. And when we look at a job analysis, we're looking at, well, let's look at what somebody does at the job. Let's look into dividing it into specific units, really small units that are specific. And these units are typically KSAs or tasks, knowledge statements, and KSAOs is really what we should be using, which is other characteristics. And that could be personality factors and things like that. In credentialing, we already know what level they're at. So they have to perform at a specific level. So that's really the key here, the difference. With a competency model, we're looking at that they perform across various levels. So we're coming in at multiple levels. Again, this is really emphasizing what I already talked about. When we do a job analysis, we show this slide to all the SMEs, all our clients, that when we put a job analysis, we're looking at what you do and what you need to know to do it in terms of importance and criticality. Incidences, even if they're low incidence in terms of frequency and they're critical important, most of the time subject matter experts agree that that should be on the exam. Water landings is what happens in the FAA, now with the pilots and things like that. So and it results in an exam, and there's different ways to do it. Some of the research methods that we use for job analysis are what we use in competency modeling, so there's really not a lot of difference there. We do make it more slimline for job analysis for credentialing because we want to save money for all of you, and we have to compete with our other vendors out there. That's been established really by the ETS folks back in the day of using a lot of these methods. And and there's different methods to use within job analysis, from the DACA model to different models that have been used over the years. But this is more of a generic model in terms of a job analysis. But again, the key difference is that it's going to result in some sort of examination blueprint or test specifications to write items that your SMEs will use to write items. And it's critical that you also identify what the seminal references are when you're writing items beforehand. If you do it during, it's always more complicated and more cumbersome to figure out after the items have been written. So this is an example of what results after a job analysis used to put together a credentialing examination. And this is for the nurse aides. And you could see here that this is, across domain areas, and you have the percentage and the number of items for a total of 60 scored items, 100%. And you could see what's going on here. And that's really the primary output of most job analyses in credentialing. And here's another example. This is the PMP. It's changed. This is the older one. It's changed this year. So, this is the percentage of items. And this is a process model in terms of, or a life cycle model of organizing your domains. And you could do that with your competency model as well when you organize the areas of competence. So let's look at a competency model. Again, the definition is really not different from a job analysis with this particular group of IO psychologists. Knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics that are needed for effective performance in the jobs in question. So that's what they're looking at the jobs, and they're saying, hey, this is all we need, all these sort of things. Other characteristics can be a lot of different things, and we'll get into those elements as well. But one example of that is personality attributes or soft skill attributes. This is how Jennifer Naughton and I have defined it over the past few years. We use the same sort of beginning, but we're saying that they have to meet a specific standard or proficiency, and it could be several different standards and proficiencies. And this is that level, whether it's an intermediate, beginner, expert, advanced, and there could be anything in between. And it's for a specified job or job role. So when we talk about all the elements required to put a competency model together, we look at the methods, the inputs or precursors, the actual competencies, which you already know are knowledge, skills, abilities, and we'll get into each of these in more detail. The data collection and research methods in terms of how we're collecting the data, and then the organizational and worker outcomes as well in this. And so some of these things, like certain like personality and worker outcomes, organizational outcomes, those are specific to our competency model, especially the worker and organizational outcomes, and we'll get into that a little bit. These are some examples of what you would want to consider before you start a competency model, and some of the things you really want to look at so that you have a good sense of how you're going to lead the subject matter experts and things like that. And this could also move into this could also be used for a lot of different things and be repurposed into a strategic document around your competency model. But what's the purpose of your intentions or scope of what you want this competency model to be, and that would also help you understand the uses that you want to get out of your competency model. And it also should align with your mission, values, and goals of the organization. And there's different sort of thing, the prerequisites of what you're offering now as a credentialing organization or an educational organization as well. And then you want to sort of also understand the demographics of your subject matter experts beyond them just holding the certification, and what type of certification. So when you look at competencies, we're looking at knowledge, skills, tasks, abilities, aptitudes, traits, states, soft skills, and personality, and other characteristics. And other characteristics are some of those things that we read about, sometimes we write about, such as neuro assessments. For instance, there are people who are competent in London as taxi drivers have a bigger hippocampus. So do you add that into your competency model? Master violin players have certain activities of the brain that light up. Do you add that to your competency model? You can. And if you have the money to do all that neuro assessment testing, that's great. There are specific neuro assessments that you could use, like the Halsted-Wrighton that's been around for since the 1940s, I believe. It's a very, very credible assessment tool, and that you can add to your whole competency list. If they do well in these areas, they're pretty qualified to go back to work and things like that in general. So your competency model is really dependent upon what you want to add. Some of these are, sometimes you add a competency model that has some really basic skills like computer skills, 8th grade math, 8th grade reading, those sort of things. So those are your fundamental skills, and we'll get into some of the models that actually use this. And then you have organizational outcomes. So anytime we have any of the competencies, we might want to rate each competency by quality, health, and safety, or by time, efficiency, or waste. So, and that could be someone who's a beginner task, a more advanced task, or expert task as well. And these are all the things you relate back and forth. And I'll get into how this all comes together in a few minutes. Worker outcomes, these are how good they're independent. There's personality traits like resilience. There's how good do they collaborate with others, their employee satisfaction, their loyalty, absenteeism, turnover, retention. Those sort of things are also important. When we look at putting together a competency model, what we tend to do is we focus on a lit review first. We look at the literature to see how competencies are talked about, or anything that could fill us in those various competencies. Then we look at resume and job descriptions. It takes us about, our staff, 2 people, about 40 hours to do, to look into a job description review. So it takes some time. It's not really that easy to do. Sometimes we look at the government's database on how they describe jobs and things like that with ONET. We don't find that as useful as the previous 2 that we discussed. And then once in a while we do interviews. One of the more famous interview techniques is a critical incident technique, founded by an Air Force psychologist who looked at cockpits and determined what was the best place to put the instrumentation, so pilots in World War II would be better at not crashing their planes. So that's the critical incident technique, and he asked pilots all these sort of things. So that gathered some data of what was really important to pilots and what they need to do in the air while flying to avoid crashes. And we spend a lot of time with focus groups and surveys. We don't do a lot of observations or work diary because that adds to the dollar price of these things. But if clients do want that, we do put that in there. So that's sort of the elements. Now what we're going to move into is the high-level competency models. When we look at the high-level concepts, some of you may be familiar with Dreyfus and Dreyfus. There's Benner, who sort of used Dreyfus and Dreyfus as her model for nurses. But what we have is the novice, the advanced beginner, competent, proficient, expert. These are all what Dreyfus and Dreyfus said in, I think, 1980. So it's somewhat been around for a while, and it's a long-lasting one. And I really like it as just to set the bar for subject matter experts when I work with them, when they put together the task and knowledge statements and other competency. So someone who's a novice tends to adhere to rules and plans, and they're really just using a lot of guidelines. They need a lot more help in terms of being less independent. When you move to competent person, they don't really need to. They sort of taken all the rules and plans and guidelines, and they kind of created a standardized way of they created a routine for their procedures, and they know how to plan now and so forth, and they're less independent as well. When you move to proficient, you tend to make decisions more quickly, and you see things more systemically, and you're more willing to deviate from those normal patterns of work, and you're still using some maxims to guide your work, but it's not necessarily at a very detailed level. When you become expert, you tend to no longer rely on rules, guidelines, and maxims. You just know how to do it. Just like riding a bicycle, you know how to, for most of us, we know how to do it. We just get on it. We don't really think much about it. And we have we're more intuitive. So intuition is unconscious pattern recognition from Gladwell's definition. So we know how to sort of know that something's not quite right. Like when I get data, I can almost feel it that it's not quite right. When I was learning to be a clinician, I sort of had a sense of maybe someone might be more depressed versus anxious, and then get into the more details of that. Is that really bereavement, or is that really that they're depressed over the years? And then you could also have a sense of whether they have a personality disorder and things like that. So versus anxiety or depression type condition. And so those are the things that you learn over time, and then you have a deep tacit understanding, so you have a good sense of it. As you move to a different generic competency model, that was Dreyfus. This is NIH's. It's actually it's very similar, except it has a little bit more detail to it. So, and these are, the novice individual just has just a basic understanding and concepts. They're using a lot what they learned from the classroom, and they're really a trainee on the job, or they're using that experience that they used. They might need help. They're really relying on really generic terminology, concepts, principles to really get through their job. And they're using a lot of the the references that are out there and resource materials to get through their job. As they get more experience, they tend to be more successful on their own to complete the task. They're usually doing it a little bit more efficiently and effectively, but they still have to, sometimes they need help once in a while from an expert. But so they're still somewhat, they're semi-independent now, and they're really trying to learn how to do this more independently, and they really can look at the implications of what they're doing in terms of process policies and procedures, and they're able to apply these process procedures and policies. When they get more towards the advanced and expert level, they are doing a lot of the stuff almost without assistance. They are the go-to person. They understand these organizational and professional issues. They are participating in these leadership type discussions and decisions. They know how to troubleshoot things and things like that. So we use this and we describe this to subject matter experts when we're building the competency model to help us level the task and knowledge statements as we go through this. So, now that we define novice, intermediate, expert, we say, okay, what are the tasks that a novice person would do? What are the tasks that an intermediate person would do? What's a task that the expert level would do? And we don't leave them with just a slide after we defined it all. We actually give them an example, and then we give them more guidance on how to move to a higher level of competency. So if you look at the current task, this is just maybe a generic task we got from, one of the inputs might have been a job analysis, or it could have been a job description, or it could have came from the literature somewhere when we did the lit review. It could be recognize the need for following a communication plan. And this is, let's say, disaster recovery or something like that. So in novice, beginner, they could, how we sort of differentiate this: basic, simple communication plan. We're using modifiers and maybe conditions to do that here. Here we're saying recognize the need across various settings. So again, we're changing it and we're saying detailed communication plan. So we added detail. Here we're like detailed and complex across all disaster settings. This should probably all have settings. Here should be various disaster settings, but this is all. So that's making it more, the expert has to know a lot more. So the level of breadth and depth is increased on expertise. I'm working with a group that has two levels of, and they're at the same expert level. The only difference is that their certifications is that one's just more breadth, and that's permissible on a certification, but it's not as common as you would think. But to change the competency levels, you could change. I'll tell you that most of my subject matter experts, they tend to change the verb. So maybe the novice is recognize, maybe the intermediate is implement, and maybe the experts evaluate. And you could use Bloom here if you need to, but remember, Bloom is a K through 12 application when it was developed by Dr. Bloom himself. So keep that in mind, that the whole, the five or six levels of Bloom, it's really for English and math applications in the K through 12 world, and it works really well if you ever study Bloom and things like that. But there's been a number of articles that say that we shouldn't be used Bloom as we use it outside of K through 12. But anyhow, that's a whole separate conversation. We actually have a document on that on our website, a one-pager. So to change the competency levels, you could change the verb, you could change the details, you could change the modifiers, which we did here with complex and detail and basic. Basics over here for the novice, details here for the intermediate, complex and detailed are here for the expert. Conditions, you could change the settings. We did it for all settings, and then various settings for intermediate on this example. So you could do a lot of things. You don't have to do all of them. You could do just one thing, like just changing the verb can do a lot. Again, when I do this, a lot of times the SMEs change the verb only, as long as it's advanced in their opinion, because I can't make that judgment. I can say, well, that looks exactly like the same thing, the intermediate and expert model. So we're looking, this is more of how we sort of look at it at a very detailed level. The generic model, if we have a generic model, we have a task one, which is at the novice level, and across organizational outcomes, again, we have other sort of things we could look at too, which is the worker outcomes. And then the organizational worker outcomes, they're defined from the literature review and the subject matter experts, and then we create rating scales around these. But in this case, this is very high level, so we kept it high level. So if they're doing a task like recognized communication plan, the novice person will only be able to do acceptable for safety, acceptable for efficiency, and acceptable for communication. So if you had a delivery person that was riding their bicycle to deliver items, you know, the novice person might be just able to do that, and then the more intermediate person would exceed expectations in safety, efficiency, and communication, and the expert would be exceptional. So that's this would be a generic model. We have a huge table that gets into each task and across this. Sometimes we do it, a lot of times more and more we do it at the domain level, but when we do it for a specific job, just a specific job, and there's like maybe 3 people who have that job, we'll do it this way so that the organization, you know, really wants to know how do they train that person up at that specific job. They're looking for 2 people to hire more. We've done that in the past, and that's been really successful for that for those organizations. And that was a Fortune 10 that we did that with. So it's really important to know that that's what you want at the outcome, the why. And we have that conversation with clients all the time. Why are you doing this? What do you want from it? And that was a unique organization because they were looking at just at the job, not a certified individual. When we're looking at certified individuals, we tend to have a bigger competency model like this, and then we get into more details. We blow these things up too here, like task, skills, knowledge. That's one area. Then your personal attributes, which could be the big 5 things, or it could be these things like with leadership, we get into dark traits. Organizational outcomes, these are just examples. All these are just examples, and worker outcomes. But that's the bigger model that we build, and then we get into the details of that, which was the previous slide here, which we go at the task level. Sometimes we go at the content or competency area, and we build it at that model. So let's look at other models used by other industries. And what's interesting is they don't share the details a lot of times. They only share the model like this here. They're looking at the areas that they're measuring, but they call them the competency model. So this is ATD's model. They're looking at, well, what do you need for an associate for talent development? So this is what they need, all these areas. But not only that, they need the foundational competencies. And you could, I mean, you could get even lower foundational competency models. What I mean by lower, like requiring 8th grade math, know how to use a pencil, know how to use a pen, know how to use a paper, and that's the stuff that, you know what paper to use, how to print a document, those sort of things, how to fax. You could add those things. I sometimes think that's ridiculous. And the ONET, the government Department of Labor tends to define those things if you need to look at a generic profession. This is the water and waste management group. They came out with this. This is used a lot in 2009. This is one of the first stackable models out there. And this gets into the stackable competency model here. So what you have is like really personal skills. So they get into some soft skills and professionalism and personality. Then they do the academics, which is reading, writing. So you could add the 8th grade stuff and computer skills and critical analytical thinking. That's always comes up no matter what competency model I do. Workplace competencies. So this is some other things. You could actually use this for some of your inputs in your own competency model if you build it. And then it gets into what they actually do, the water and wastewater industry here. So, and then there's management competencies as you climb up and occupational specific sort of things. So that's another model. So this is the SHRM model, very to the point. It just goes over the areas, but this is what they call their competency model. So you could see how you could really quickly take your job analysis, put in some really neat graphics, put it in a circle and call it your competency model. But we don't know what SHRM's done beyond this. I don't really know what they've done beyond this because they don't share more than this. It could be your task and knowledge statements from your job analysis, and that's a minimum for a competency model, because they're defining, they're not defining those levels. So that's one thing to consider here. My battery's running low, so let me just plug this in here. And so the next model would be the rehabilitation nursing. They get into domains and subdomains. You could look at, in this domain is promotion of successful living, leadership, and things like that. And then they get into this. It's depends how you want to put it forward. We're working on a similar model where there's domains and subdomains, and so we're probably going to build something close to this when it comes to technical skills. And then this one's really very different from a lot of the things that I see out there. These are sort of your domains, and then this is the process that happens. And one can argue that this is more like a bloom, or perfecting might be more at the expert level. So this goes across the levels, which is really neat. And then it gives you the subdomains, or the areas that you need to work on as you move up in becoming a better marketer, it looks like. I think ABM is the marketing group. So that's another model that's out there. This one's really interesting because it does go into like, basic, intermediate, and expert here. And these are the areas that you would have to have expertise. So this is a lot more very straightforward on what areas would people expect to be advanced versus intermediate versus foundational, or that novice level. So that's another way you could organize it. Once in a while I have clients that do it this way as well. This one is a lot like the ATD, where this is really your foundational, but this goes across all the phases. So this is a phase one, where you go phase, and this is what you need to know in this phase of what you're doing, and then this is phase 2, and this is what you need to know, and this is phase 3 that's specific to it. But then these are all the things you need to know across it. But again, you don't know what level they're at. Is this at a low level, high level, and all that? So we don't know that. And a lot of these, we don't know what level they're trying to look at, whereas when we do it, we know what levels they're looking at. We know that if they're at a novice level, we know whether they're independent on this task or not independent. We know whether they're more efficient on this task or not efficient versus an expert and intermediate. So those are some models that are out there in our industry. So once you build a competency model, what do you do next? And that's really a good question, and clients ask me that question all the time. And it's not different from having a job analysis, as I alluded earlier. You could build your competency model to have education. You know what an expert requires, and now you know what training they need from intermediate to expert. You know what training they need from novice to intermediate. Same with the assessments. You know what areas to test on if you have an assessment, and you could even focus on the smaller areas, and you could call it a micro-credential instead of testing on everything, because you're just testing a smaller area. You can even do nano-credentialing if it's just a specific knowledge, but that's how I sort of look at a micro and nano credentials. You could look at using this for employment decisions. Are they as independent as you would like them to be at this point? Well, they're not really as independent because independent on these tasks that we would expect everyone to be independent on. Are they collaborating on these tasks as they should be? Because this is a task that everyone said you should collaborate on, and they're not. So you could start looking at, you know, selection, recruiting, and things like that, decisions that could be used for that. If you go down that road with employment decisions, you have to consider the uniform standards so that you don't break any laws when you make those decisions. And then there's performance reviews that you could look at as well, which is very similar to whether you want to hire, fire, and things like that, and recruit, maintain, things like improve someone's work. Then there's professional development offerings, which goes into education and training. And there's diagnostics. So you could say, hey, you could actually give them the competency model and ask them to self-diagnostic or self-assess themselves, or give them a self-diagnostic like that. Or you could use it to create diagnostics to say, hey, you know what, you're not really doing that as well as your peers on this. Why don't you, based upon your self-assessment of yourself, it doesn't have to be a self-assessment, you can create an actual assessment and do that as well. So those are some of the potential uses. There's a lot more you could do, but these are some of the areas you could focus on. You know, the one group that we worked with that was at Fortune 10, they were really interested in how can we find someone that's going to have these skills, so that they were really better at the interview. So they used it for the interview when they were looking at candidates. And then they were trying to figure out how can we support the person we hire, because what they were having were retaining issues, and they thought having a competency model would help them, one, select people that they would retain, and that's where your personality assessments could come into a factor. You could look at the expert level and what their personality factors are on some personality assessment, like the Big Five is which we use, but you could use MMPI and different other things. You could be specific to just a resilience scale or a grit scale, and see how that compares from expert to novice. So when you're hiring someone on personality and you want someone to really stay there and you want them to become an expert, you already know what the personality factors are for that individual. So, and they use that to help them as well. So in closing, we have some things that we always like to hear from you in terms of suggestions or questions when it comes to this. If you're doing something, let us know. I know before this, someone had asked me if I use the DACM method. I know of it. I have the entire manual. I read the manual twice. I don't tend to use that method for job analysis, but they were asking me about that. And so you can use the DACM as an input. You could use the DACM to probably put the competency model in terms of facilitating and identifying some of the competencies for it, because you're identifying task and knowledge statements and other KSAs as well, so you can use that. So there's some upcoming presentations. Now that ATP is going to be virtual, if you're interested in performance assessments and gamification, I'll be presenting with Nikki Etchell, and then on that, and then your job analysis, it goes into more detail than this, but some of the content that we described here gets into this. I'm doing that with a few colleagues that had their credential. I'm the only vendor on that panel, so there's 3 other folks, one from the American Payroll Association, NCARB, and the Social Worker Association. And then Jennifer Naughton, Chris Weiss from CFA, and myself are gonna really do something that I've never seen done in this field. Is we're evaluating the quality of the CFA program, and we're actually also looking at other programs around all these metrics, like 200-300 metrics that we identified across business and psychometrics and other sort of things. So we're evaluating it against 4 other organizations in different groups. One of them's in finance, one of them's in IT, and we can't reveal those groups, but we could reveal that CFA was the one that was the base evaluation. And then the other thing that we're going to do is and you can register for this now. We'll send that registration link. But a lot of clients of mine, a lot of people in the field, they'll come to me at least once a month. I'll get a call and say, I don't really like my pass rates. I'm really concerned that no one's passing it. Nobody really comes to me when everyone's passing it, but it's usually when there's a pass rate or some sector of their group is not passing it. So how can we deal with this? And we'll talk about that. At the end of the day, you could do anything you want in terms of pass rates, but there's legal validity, ethical considerations, and I always will tell you to do what's legal and ethical and valid. But there are ways to meet that by selecting and adjusting and living with your pass rates there. If you need more information, you could always go to airexperts.com and set up a call with me. And if you're really interested in doing a job analysis in the future, or a competency model, let us know. Again, we could do this all virtually, given it's getting more and more difficult to get in the next month or two, probably, with getting folks together with public health and safety concerns with the coronavirus. If there's any questions, you could ask them now. I'm going to also put a poll up there to ask you a few more questions. So we're open to questions. So one of the things that I have right now in the question box is the first is more of a comment saying that there's job analysis focus on job tasks, constantly focuses on the person, but in reality there's a lot of overlaps, which is another good point to make. And then another question is, can you share the link to the document about Bloom's K through 12? I'll do that in a moment. Another one is, we want to use a competency model to help build customized learning plans. You certainly can do that. I had clients do that. That's one of the uses, is education training, and you could do it at certain levels as well, and you could do it at a micro level too. So you could do it at a domain or subdomain level, or a certain content area. You can even do it at a specific knowledge area. I mean, I think that's obvious, but it's permissible to do if you want to do that. So I don't know if there's any other questions, but I'd like you to answer some polls if you're willing to. I put a poll out there right now. Oops. And then I don't know if there's any other questions. I'm going to look for that document. Otherwise, I want to thank you for your time on this. And if you have any questions, we're around.